You know what's crazy? There's this one battle in World War II that nobody really talks about, but it literally changed everything. And I'm not exaggerating when I say the Japanese pilots who survived it had nightmares for the rest of their lives. Because imagine this. You're up in the sky, doing what you've been trained to do, and suddenly you look around and there are American fighters everywhere. And I don't mean like a few dozen. I mean 450 of them, just filling the entire sky like a swarm. The Japanese called it the day the sky turned dark. And what happened next was so one-sided, so brutal, that it basically ended Japan's ability to fight in the air for the rest of the war. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you the full story of what actually happened over the Marianas Islands in June 1944. And trust me, by the end of this, you're going to understand why this battle was so important and why it's sometimes called the greatest carrier battle in history. Alright, so let me set the scene for you. It's June 1944. The war in the Pacific has been going on for 2.5 years at this point. The Japanese had this massive empire stretching across the Pacific, and the Americans were slowly pushing them back, island by island. It was brutal work. Every island was a fight. Every beach landing cost lives. But the Americans had a plan. They wanted to take the Mariana Islands. Now you might be wondering why the Marianas mattered so much. Here's the thing. These islands, specifically Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, were in this perfect spot. If the Americans could take them, they could build airfields there. And from those airfields, the new B-29 Superfortress bombers could reach mainland Japan. That was huge. That meant they could start bombing Japanese cities and factories directly. The Japanese knew this too. They knew that if they lost the Marianas, the war was basically over for them. So they had to defend these islands no matter what. The Japanese Navy put together this massive fleet. They called it the Mobile Fleet, and it was commanded by this guy named Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa. Now, Ozawa was actually a pretty smart commander. He knew the Americans had more ships, more planes, more everything. But he had a plan. Japanese carrier planes had longer range than American planes. So his idea was to hit the American carriers from far away, where the Americans couldn't hit back. Then his planes would land on the airfields in the Marianas, refuel, and attack the Americans again on the way back. It was actually pretty clever. If it worked, he could damage the American fleet without getting too close. But there was one massive problem with this plan, and Ozawa didn't know about it yet. The Japanese pilot quality had completely fallen apart. See, back in 1941 and 1942, Japanese naval pilots were some of the best in the world. These guys had years of training. Some of them had been flying since the 1930s. They had combat experience from the war in China. They were really, really good. But here's what happened. In all those battles in 1942 and 1943, the Coral Sea, Midway, the Guadalcanal Campaign, the Solomons, all of those battles killed off most of Japan's experienced pilots. And unlike the Americans, Japan didn't rotate their pilots back home to train new ones. They kept them in combat until they died. So by 1944, almost all of those skilled pilots were gone. And the new pilots, they were terrible. I'm not being mean, they just genuinely didn't have enough training. Japan was running out of fuel, running out of time, running out of everything. So these new pilots were getting like a third of the training time that the old pilots got. Some of them had barely 100 hours of flight time before they were sent into combat. That's nothing. American pilots were getting 300, 400, sometimes 500 hours of training. Plus, the Americans had been rotating experienced combat pilots back to teach the new guys. So American pilot quality was actually getting better as the war went on, while Japanese pilot quality was getting worse. But Ozawa either didn't know how bad it was, or he was ignoring it. He thought his plan could work. So the Mobile fleet sailed out with 9 aircraft carriers and over 400 planes. On the American side, you had Admiral Raymond Spruance commanding the 5th Fleet, and Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher commanding the carrier task force. Mitcher was this quiet, serious guy who always wore this baseball cap and never said much, but he was absolutely brilliant at carrier warfare. The Americans had 15 carriers and over 900 aircraft. It wasn't even close in terms of numbers. So on June 15, 1944, American Marines landed on Saipan. The Japanese on the island fought hard, but the invasion was going forward. Ozawa got word of this and started moving his fleet into position. The Americans knew the Japanese fleet was coming. Their submarines had spotted them. So Mitcher wanted to go after the Japanese carriers immediately, just sail west and attack them. But Spruance said no. His main job was to protect the invasion force on Saipan. He was worried that if he sailed too far west, the Japanese might sneak around him and attack the troop transports and the Marines on the beach. So he kept the fleet close to the Marianas and waited for the Japanese to come to him. Now June 18th is when things started getting tense. American submarines were tracking the Japanese fleet. And then, early in the morning of June 19th, one of those subs, the USS Albacore, spotted a Japanese carrier. The Albacore fired torpedoes and hit the carrier Taiho. Now the Taiho was Ozawa's flagship, the newest and most advanced carrier Japan had. The hit didn't seem that bad at first. Just one torpedo. The ship was still moving, still operating. But there was a fuel leak that nobody noticed right away, and the damage control team made a mistake. They tried to ventilate the ship to get rid of the fuel fumes, but that just spread the fumes everywhere. A few hours later, there was a massive explosion. The whole ship went up. Over 1,600 men died, including most of Ozawa's staff. Ozawa himself survived and transferred to a cruiser, but he'd lost his flagship and all his communication equipment. He was basically flying blind for the rest of the battle. Then another American submarine, the USS Kavala, found another Japanese carrier, the Shikaku. This was one of the carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor. The Kavala hit it with multiple torpedoes, and the Shikaku exploded and sank too. Another 1,200 men gone. So before the air battle even started, the Japanese had already lost 2 big carriers. But the main event was about to begin. Early on the morning of June 19th, Japanese search planes found the American fleet. Ozawa decided to launch his attack. He sent out his planes in 4 big waves. The first wave had 69 planes. The second wave had 130 planes. The third had 47. The fourth had 82. That's over 300 aircraft heading toward the American carriers. Now here's where things get interesting. The Americans had this new technology called radar. The Japanese had radar too, but the American radar was way better. So the American ships picked up the Japanese planes when they were still over 100 miles away. That gave Mitcher plenty of time to prepare. He launched every fighter he had, and most of those fighters were F6F Hellcats. The Hellcat was this beautiful piece of engineering. It was tough, it was fast, it was heavily armed, and it could take a beating. It was specifically designed to counter the Japanese Zero. The Zero was lighter and more maneuverable, but the Hellcat was faster and much more durable. American pilots learned not to try to dogfight the Zero in slow, turning battles. Instead, they used boom and zoom tactics. Dive down fast, shoot, then climb back up using their speed. The Hellcat was perfect for this. So when the first wave of Japanese planes came in, they ran straight into over 200 Hellcats, and it was a slaughter. The American pilots were better trained, their planes were better, and they had the advantage of altitude because they'd been warned so early. The Japanese pilots didn't stand a chance. Out of that first wave of 69 planes, only 27 made it back, and the ones that did get through to the American fleet didn't do much damage. They hit one battleship with a bomb that barely did anything. The second wave was even worse for the Japanese. 130 planes ran into this wall of American fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The American ships had gotten really good at anti-aircraft defense by this point. They had these formations where the ships would position themselves to create overlapping fields of fire. They had proximity-fused shells that would explode near planes even if they didn't hit them directly. It was devastating. Out of 130 planes in the second wave, only 31 made it back. And again, they did almost no damage to the American ships. The third and fourth waves, same story. Most of them were shot down. Some of them got lost and couldn't even find the American fleet. Some ran out of fuel and had to ditch in the ocean. By the end of June 19th, the Japanese had lost about 330 aircraft. The Americans lost maybe 30. That's an 11-to-1 kill ratio. It was so one-sided that American pilots started calling it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Like the Japanese planes were just turkeys being shot out of the sky. And here's the thing that made it even worse for the Japanese. Remember Ozawa's plan about his planes landing on the Mariana airfields to refuel? Well, American planes had already bombed those airfields. So when Japanese planes tried to land there, they either got shot down or couldn't land because the runways were destroyed. Some pilots ditched their planes in the ocean near the islands and had to swim to shore. So by the end of June 19th, the Japanese had lost 2 carriers to submarines and over 300 aircraft. The American fleet was basically untouched, but Spruance and Mitchell didn't know exactly where the Japanese carriers were. They'd been so focused on defense that they hadn't sent out many search planes. That night, everyone was trying to figure out what to do next. The next morning, June 20th, American search planes finally found the Japanese fleet. But there was a problem. They were far away, really far, like 275 miles away, and it was already late afternoon. If Mitchell launched a strike, his planes would have to fly all that way, attack, and then fly back in the dark. Most of his pilots had never landed on a carrier at night. It was incredibly dangerous. Plus, the planes might not have enough fuel to make it back. But Mitchell made the call. He said launch the strike. He knew this might be their only chance to destroy the Japanese carrier fleet. So at around 4 p.m., 216 American planes took off. Hellcats, Heldover dive bombers, and Avenger torpedo bombers. They flew west as fast as they could. They found the Japanese fleet just before sunset, and they attacked. The Japanese carriers tried to maneuver and their fighters tried to defend, but there weren't many fighters left after the previous day's losses. American dive bombers came screaming down on the carriers. The carrier Hio took multiple torpedo and bomb hits and sank. The carriers Zuikaku and Chiyoda were damaged. 2 other carriers were hit. Several other Japanese ships were damaged too. But now the Americans had a problem. It was getting dark and they were a long way from home. The planes turned around and started flying back, but many of them were running out of fuel. Pilots were watching their fuel gauges drop lower and lower. Some planes ran out of fuel and had to ditch in the ocean. The pilots who survived were floating in the dark water, hoping someone would find them. When the planes started arriving back at the American carriers, it was completely dark. Pilots were trying to find the carriers, but it was almost impossible. So Mitchell made another gutsy call. He ordered all the ships to turn on their lights. Every searchlight, every signal light, even just the regular deck lights. He lit up the whole fleet like a Christmas tree. This was incredibly risky because it made them easy targets for any Japanese submarines or planes in the area. But Mitchell decided saving his pilots was worth the risk. Even with the lights on, landing was chaos. Pilots were so exhausted and low on fuel that they were just trying to land on any carrier they could find. Some landed on the wrong ship. Some crashed on the deck. Some missed the deck entirely and went into the water. It was a mess. But the lights worked. Most of the pilots made it back. Out of the 216 planes that launched, about 80 didn't make it back. But a lot of those pilots were rescued from the water over the next few days. American destroyers and seaplanes searched the area and picked up dozens of pilots floating in life rafts. So when you add it all up, in 2 days of fighting, the Japanese lost 3 carriers sunk, and the others were damaged and their air groups were basically wiped out. They lost over 600 aircraft total, including the ones destroyed on the ground in the Marianas. They lost hundreds of pilots. The American losses were much smaller. A couple hundred planes and maybe 100 aircrew. The Japanese carrier force never recovered from this. They had carriers left, but they didn't have the planes or pilots to make them effective. For the rest of the war, Japanese carriers were basically useless. And the battle had other effects too. With the Japanese fleet defeated, the Americans could continue the invasion of the Marianas without worrying about being attacked from the sea. Saipan fell in July, then Tinian, then Guam, and just like the Americans planned, they built those airfields and started bombing Japan with B-29s. The fall of Saipan was such a disaster for Japan that their prime minister, Hideki Tojo, resigned. The Japanese government knew they were losing. But let me tell you about what it was like from the Japanese pilot perspective, because that's what makes this battle so haunting. There are accounts from some of the pilots who survived, and they all say the same thing. They were terrified. They'd been told they were going to fight the Americans, but nothing prepared them for what they saw. One pilot said he looked up and the sky was just full of American planes. Everywhere he looked, there were Hellcats. He said it felt like trying to fight a thunderstorm. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. Another pilot said he saw his friends getting shot down all around him, and there was nothing he could do. The American planes were faster, and the American pilots were better. He said he felt like a child trying to fight an adult. And the thing is, these young Japanese pilots knew they weren't ready. They knew they didn't have enough training, but they went anyway because they thought it was their duty. A lot of them wrote letters home before the battle, and some of those letters survived. They're heartbreaking. These kids, some of them 18 or 19 years old, writing to their parents saying they know they probably won't come back. And they didn't. Most of them died over the Philippine Sea, shot down by American fighters or by anti-aircraft fire, or they ran out of fuel and crashed into the ocean. There's this one story about a Japanese pilot named Sakyo Komatsu. He was one of the few experienced pilots Japan had left. He'd survived multiple battles and was considered an ace. During the Marianas battle, he led a group of younger pilots. He managed to survive the first day, but he saw almost all of his wingmen get killed. On the second day, his plane was damaged, and he had to ditch in the ocean. He was rescued by a Japanese submarine, but he was so traumatized by what he'd seen that he could barely speak. He later said that the Americans didn't just defeat them. They completely overwhelmed them. He said it felt like the Japanese were fighting with sticks and stones, while the Americans had machine guns. And here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. The Americans weren't just better because they had more planes or better technology. They were better because their whole system was better. They had better training programs. They had better logistics, so their ships always had fuel and ammunition and spare parts. They had better damage control, so even when their ships got hit, they could keep fighting. They had better communication systems, so their commanders could coordinate their forces effectively. They had better intelligence, so they knew where the enemy was. They had better everything. Japan, on the other hand, was falling apart. Their economy was collapsing. They were running out of oil, which meant they couldn't train pilots properly because they didn't have enough fuel for training flights. They were running out of raw materials, so they couldn't build as many planes. Their factories were being bombed. Their shipping was being destroyed by American submarines, so they couldn't move supplies around their empire. They were losing on every front, and the Marianas battle just made it obvious. But Japan kept fighting for another year after this. And that's the tragic part. Everyone knew Japan couldn't win, but they kept sending young men to die anyway. After the Marianas, Japan started using kamikaze tactics more and more because they didn't have enough skilled pilots to fight conventionally. They just loaded planes with bombs and had pilots crash them into American ships. It was a desperate, horrible tactic, and it cost thousands of young Japanese lives for very little gain. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, whatever you want to call it, was the moment when Japan's defeat became inevitable. They could have fought on for years, but they couldn't change the outcome. The Americans were too strong, too well-supplied, too well-trained. And the Japanese had lost too many experienced people who couldn't be replaced. I think about those Japanese pilots a lot. They were on the wrong side of history, fighting for an empire that had done terrible things across Asia. But individually, a lot of them were just scared kids who'd been told to fight and die for their country. And they did. They flew out into a sky filled with enemy fighters, knowing they probably wouldn't come back. That takes a kind of courage, even if it was courage in service of a bad cause. On the American side, you had guys who were also scared, also young, but they had better training and better equipment and they knew they were winning. Still, it wasn't easy for them either. Shooting down hundreds of enemy planes sounds glorious, but when you read the accounts from American pilots, a lot of them talk about how unsettling it was, how easy it was. They said the Japanese pilots just didn't know what they were doing. Some American pilots felt bad about it, like they were shooting fish in a barrel. Others just felt relieved that they survived. And then there were those American pilots who had to ditch in the ocean on the night of June 20th, floating in the dark, hoping someone would find them before they died of exposure or sharks got them. That must have been terrifying, but most of them were rescued, which shows you how much the Americans cared about their people. They risked lighting up the whole fleet just to save their pilots. The Japanese would never have done that. They had this whole culture around not retreating, not giving up, fighting to the death. It made them fierce fighters in some situations, but it also meant they wasted lives that could have been saved. After the battle, Admiral Ozawa was heavily criticized by some people in the Japanese Navy, but honestly, it wasn't really his fault. He was working with what he had, and what he had wasn't enough. You can't win a battle when your pilots are undertrained and your whole industrial base is collapsing. Some Japanese officers understood this. They knew the war was lost, but the government wouldn't admit it, so the war dragged on for another year, and hundreds of thousands more people died. The Marianas Campaign continued through the summer of 1944. The islands were taken one by one. The fighting on the ground was brutal. The Japanese soldiers and even civilians on Saipan often chose to kill themselves rather than surrender. There are these cliffs on Saipan where hundreds of Japanese civilians jumped to their deaths because they'd been told the Americans would torture and kill them. It's one of the darkest moments of the whole war. But eventually, the islands were secured, the airfields were built, and the B-29 started flying missions to Japan. By early 1945, American bombers were burning Japanese cities to the ground. The firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 killed more people in one night than either of the atomic bombs did. Japan's cities were being destroyed, their fleet was gone, their army was being pushed back on every front. And still, they didn't surrender. It took 2 atomic bombs in August 1945 to finally end it. But the end really started at the Marianas. That's when Japan lost the ability to fight back effectively. Everything after that was just a slow, grinding march to the inevitable conclusion. And it all came down to that one day, June 19, 1944, when 450 American Hellcats filled the sky and the Japanese pilots realized they were completely outmatched. So yeah, that's the story of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It's not a fair or pretty story. War never is. But it's an important one because it shows you how wars are really won. Not just by brave men fighting hard, but by training, by logistics, by industry, by having a system that works. The Japanese had brave men. They had skilled engineers, but they didn't have the resources or the system to sustain a long war against a country as big and industrialized as the United States. And by June 1944, that reality came crashing down on them all at once, over the Philippine Sea, in a battle that lasted 2 days and changed everything. The next time you hear someone talk about World War II in the Pacific, ask them if they know about the Marianas Turkey Shoot. And if you found this story interesting, maybe check out the next video.